is September 11th. 11 years ago on that date, America entered a new age of terror. The attacks on New York and Washington, D.C. made us feel uniquely vulnerable. And this sense of vulnerability has directed our foreign policy for more than a decade. It has also influenced our actions here at home, leading to unprecedented restrictions on our civil liberties, and leading many to presume to know who among us is threatening, dangerous, and potentially a terrorist. That presumption is based on our definition of terror, what it is and who commits it. Now, terrorism is more than simply violence. Assassins and mass murderers are not necessarily terrorists. Terrorists choose their targets because of their identity or because of their connection to a government. Terrorists act with the goal of creating and paralyzing fear. That's why September 11th, 2001 was not the first act of terrorism in America. For example, for decades, the Ku Klux Klan terrorized black communities. In 1995, Timothy McVeigh bombed the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City to shame and terrify the government. But these acts of terrorism did not lead us to define all white men as potential threats to the safety and security of the United States. But the horror of September 11th, 2001 led far too many to assume that all Muslims or assumed Muslims are potential threats. Terrorism not only makes people feel afraid, it makes them feel alone. It hampers dialogue, connection, and shared experience. Terrorists win when we turn on each other, like when we protest a symbol of reconciliation, such as the so-called Ground Zero Mosque. It opened last year with a gallery of photographs featuring children in New York City. 11 years later, I want to ask not about the foreign wars that 9/11 initiated, but whether a domestic peace is possible. Joining me now to ponder these questions are Interfaith Youth Corps founder and president Eboo Patel, Amani Jamal, a politics professor at Princeton University and author of Empires and Citizens, Pro-American Democracy or No Democracy at All, and Valerie Kaur, a Sikh American filmmaker and advocate who has chronicled hate violence against the Sikh community for more than a decade. Thank you all for being here. Amani, I want to start with you. Tell me a little bit about the data. I've made a claim that post 9/11, we developed a new notion of who is the other, who is the threat. Do the data show us that?
Absolutely. If you look at public opinion, favorability scores towards Muslim Americans after 9/11 and looking at them today, a decade later, the average American is far more worried and suspicious of the average Muslim than they were a decade ago, right after 9/11. So in the last decade, things have gotten much worse for the Muslim community.
Oh, so it's grown, that sense of anxiety has actually grown over the past 10 years?
Absolutely. I mean, coupled with an environment and an atmosphere that has complicitly and explicitly promoted Islamophobia, whether it's from public officials, the media, public opinion, Islamophobia today is far worse than it was at the eve of 9/11.
You know, Eboo, I'm a little obsessed with your book. I've been spending a lot of time with it. It's got sticky notes on it. But exactly this idea is part of what I felt resonating in it. You write about feeling like there was never a moment previously, before 9/11, where it was even really a question to imagine yourself as both Muslim and American, but that particularly the so-called Ground Zero Mosque became a moment of recognizing just how much those identities had pulled apart.
Right. So, you know, during that discourse, my mom called me and said about my two kids who are 5 and 2 years old and are watching right now. Hi, Zaid and Khalil. She said, you know, you should change your kids' names because they sound a little bit too Muslim. That's how afraid Muslims were. But I have to say that fear has also transferred into something different for me. I've been spending a lot of time reading about the civil rights movement, and what struck me so much about that is that the people in this nation, African Americans, who have experienced the harshest side of American prejudice, decided that they wanted to build America's promise. Yeah. They decided that America was not a lie, but a broken promise, and they gave their bodies and their blood to save that. And I think about this line from Langston Hughes: "America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be." And that's inspiring the work we're doing at Interfaith Youth Corps. It inspired me to write this book, Sacred Ground, this notion that all names are American names, that the bridge, that the hyphen between Muslim and American is a bridge, not a barrier.
Yeah, I've heard Ben Jealous talk about this idea that he had a great-grandfather who was born a slave and died a senator. And that idea that, you know, when that happens, one is sort of an expansive story about America, but the other piece is who in the world who was born into slavery would think, oh, I know, I'll run for office in that government, right? That sense of hope and possibility. And yet, Valerie, you and I have talked a lot about how post 9/11 violence against Muslims, but then misdirected violence that was meant to be directed against Muslims, but gets directed against the Sikh community. And so when I heard about Oak Creek, I could not believe it was happening more than 10 years later. Remind us what the Oak Creek tragedy is.
So a gunman who was cultured in the ways of hate in America was a product of hate groups in America, walked into a Sikh Gurdwara, which is a house of worship, on a Sunday morning and opened gunfire on August 5th. I spent most of the last month in Oak Creek with the families and the kids who lost their parents in that massacre. 6 were murdered. Their pain and their grief is profound. You know, for the Sikh community, the tragedy is not only the greatest tragedy in Sikh American history, but it's a moment of violence that has shaken us in the last decade, even in the last 100 years of history, as a moment that calls us to action. But what was unprecedented was that we received unprecedented national attention, that flags were lowered, that thousands of people attended vigils, that Groundswell and Auburn Seminary alone collected and delivered 4,000 letters of support. So what I saw was that kind of support really emboldened young people in Oak Creek and really across the country to face the sea of cameras and to tell the story of their faith. And to call for an end to hate, not just against Sikh Americans, but really all people still struggling to live as free and equal Americans in this country.
And it feels to me like part of the challenge that Sikh Americans face is even what we've seen our president facing, which is every time you do a Muslim denialist, every time you say, but I'm not a Muslim, you actually reinforce Islamophobia.
Right, that's exactly right. I mean, the big problem for the Muslim community, at least from a spectator perspective, is that every time an event like Wisconsin happens or Obama is accused of being Muslim, immediately you'll see, well, they weren't really Muslim, or Obama really isn't Muslim, almost by default saying, well, if they were,
it would be
all the better.
That's right.
That's right. It would be. That's right. If you were Muslim, it would be illegitimate for him to be president of the United States.
Absolutely. A Muslim should not be president of the United States, and Obama has gone to a great extent. President Obama has gone to a great extent in denying any any roots that are actually Muslim.
Yeah, we have much more on this, and when we come back, we'll talk more about the 9/11 legacy that we need to extinguish. Our guest, Valerie Kaur, got her start as a documentary filmmaker shortly after the September 11th attacks, with a documentary fittingly titled Divided We Fall, in which she explored how life was for Muslims, Sikhs, and other marginalized groups who are stereotyped as terrorists in the aftermath of 9/11.
The minute I saw what happened, I told him, Sikhs are in for a hard time. Be prepared.
Oh, yeah, anybody could be a target.
You told me to go home, right? Yeah, basically. I don't care where you're at.
You know, there's a lot of backlash. He said to me, well, what do you expect? You expect people to come around and give you roses?
So, post 9/11, there is this backlash.
It's troubling that it's been 11 years later and we're still struggling to be seen as fully American in this country. You know, Oak Creek, though, is not just a Sikh American tragedy. It's unique among American tragedies. It could be the largest racially motivated mass shooting in recent U.S. history. So what I'm really proud about is that Sikh Americans are coming out and saying we need our government to do more to combat hate against all groups in America. We need to look at domestic terrorism. We need our Congress to hold congressional hearings that look at hate groups. And I'm very proud to say that we're working with the Interfaith Youth Corps, Groundswell, Auburn Seminary to bring that kind of dialogue to combat hate on U.S. college campuses.
Yeah, and Ibo, Valerie brings up the U.S. Congress. As I was reading your text, Sacred Ground, which I think more than anything else, it's interesting that you talk about the civil rights movement, because it's a kind of language about beloved community, right? The ways in which the American exceptionalism could be understood as our pluralism. But you tell this story about Newt Gingrich that I was riveted by. Tell the viewers.
So, you know, just briefly on beloved community, I want to say that it's obviously Martin Luther King Jr. who advances that idea in America, and I'm here to do this talk at Union Theological Seminary Monday night on the interfaith influences on King. And so as I sit with you all, I think to myself, interfaith cooperation is such at the heart of the American story, and we're looking for a new generation to rise up and write the next chapter. Having said that, Newt Gingrich was interestingly part of that positive story of interfaith cooperation not so long ago. My friend Suhail Khan, who was a Republican congressional staffer in the mid to late 1990s, needed a place to pray in the Capitol, pray Juma prayers on Friday afternoon. The Speaker of the House of Representatives at that time was Newt Gingrich and provided him that place to pray. We need more Americans to stand up and be the 1996, 1997 version of that, right? To be welcoming the contributions of all communities in this country and nurturing cooperation between them, because that's what America is about.
Right. So what I loved about this story is I'm like, okay, so as Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich is prepared in that moment to provide space for the Friday prayers. I mean, almost like a second thought. He kind of waves his hands, of course. But that's not the Newt Gingrich we see today. And it's not so much just because Gingrich has changed, but because the incentive structure has changed for an American politician.
Absolutely. It has become now socially acceptable, if not socially desirable, to be anti-Muslim in the United States. So the whole campaign, you know, where you see where a turn to the right, if you may, it has been on this Islamophobia bandwagon, and it's basically who's going to join it and who's going to join it more fiercely. That's the irony of all of this.
Right. There's an anti-Sharia law plank, right, in the Republican convention party platform.
Basically, there are anti-Sharia campaigns in about 33 states in the United States, Sharia laws which have never even emerged. I mean, if you were to ask me, somebody who studies the Muslim world and the Arab world, what is the content of these laws, they really don't exist.
Right. So let me ask you one last piece on this. The Democratic Party and President Obama's re-election campaign is very much making the death of Osama bin Laden a central foreign policy achievement, which I think, you know, Americans would agree with. But I also always have just a little bit of a like, is there any way in which that continues to make us think that Muslims are in fact our enemy?
Right. Let's make the death of hate in America our most important achievement as a nation. You know, the most American thing you can do is stand up for the dignity of somebody else. And I'm so proud that Muslim Americans are praying and standing with Sikh Americans. I'm so proud that we're a nation that recognizes that although there are people preaching that we're better apart or better divided, what we know at Interfaith Youth Corps at Groundswell is that we're better together, and we have to build that country.
That's right. What gives me hope is a rising generation that has come of age in the shadow of 9/11, but is now stepping out into the light. The kids in Oak Creek, actually, Melissa asked me to give you this gift. It's an orange bracelet that simply says August 5th, 2012. They wanted me to thank you for not forgetting them this 9/11 anniversary.
Thank you. I will not cry on television. Okay, I thank all of you for being here. Thank you to Eboo Patel and to Amani Jamal. Valerie is going to stick around for our next hour, and when we come back, the solution to our divided government.